In a world filled with conflict, in a universe comprised of differences, there's one thing that absolutely everything shares in common. We all exist. Including two guys named Jack and Michael, who like to chat about that very thing over a good cup of coffee. Let's pay them a visit, shall we?
Existence Brewing.
Meatloaf. Man, meatloaf at a coffee place does not sound like a very good menu item.
Well, maybe he's playing here. Are you sure they don't mean Meatloaf is going to be performing live on their little stage out there?
Yeah, right. Hey, Jack, how's it going?
Good. It's nothing like Paradise by the Dashboard Lights to a cup of coffee that's $8.
Well, I don't know if that's a drink or if it's actual meat of the loaf, but because sometimes this place likes to mix up the drinks and the food items so that you can't really tell which is which anymore.
That's what Hamburger Helper is marketed as, by the way, in Britain. Meat of the loaf. We call it meat of the loaf here. It's not Hamburger Helper. Loaf. I wouldn't help those dastardly Germans anyway, Hamburger Helper. Give me a break. I'm not helping anyone from Hamburg. They tried to bomb us, you know that.
Which is which? That would be a good one for like Pink Floyd Day.
Are you, like me, are you not surprised a little bit that Disney hasn't sued the people that make Hamburger Helper for stealing Mickey Mouse's hand? Because you'll note that the Hamburger Helper hand is the same as Mickey Mouse's glove. It's a thumb with 3 fingers.
Yeah.
And how do we know the face couldn't just be on the other side of his glove?
That's a really good point, Jack. I think you just brought up something. I think that needs to be addressed by Disney's attorneys.
Yeah.
I know that they have addressed the very close resemblance of Donald Duck to the University of Oregon mascot.
Oh, yes, because we can't have too many ducks that look that similar.
Yeah.
Sure.
And the irony, and obviously Disney has an amazing repertoire of material that they've created. But the funny thing about Disney is that he actually started using subject matter that was purposefully in the public domain. A lot of his original fairy tales were all public domain property, and he capitalized on the public domain. So there is some irony in that too.
Well, that's sort of like the children's literary or cartoon, slant for like CIA hide it in plain sight. You know
yes.
what I mean? It's the same directive. It's the same MO. It's just, I'm going to hide this in plain sight by using things that are in the public's evidence. But I'm sure Disney's lawyers have plenty to do right now. They don't need this. I always felt like the closest looking to Donald Duck was on, those Mexican like Hostess products, the Jacintos. You ever seen those?
Yes.
There's a duck on those. It's like it's a marshmallow filled ho-ho or something with a little apricot jelly stripe in it. It looks like it's probably guava or something like that. Never had one.
They're amazing. Yeah. You should get one. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's it. It's going on my grocery list this weekend. Jacinto.
Yeah. Those. Yeah, those and then the candies were actually something a few summers ago that I went way down the rabbit hole. There's a Mexican grocery store not too far from where I work. And so I would on my way home would swing in there, and I just loved the candy. It's very kind of a mixture of sweet and sour, and there's like some chili powder in there and just really unique flavors. And I would go in there and I would pick up these different candies. And there was a summer there where I kind of went crazy on trying these new Mexican candies. And where I drew the line was I actually came home once with just these containers of salt because I didn't know what they were. And I thought that they were candy. No, it was just salt. And it was lime flavored salt. And the funny thing about it is that anybody who's ever really gone down the Mexican candy rabbit hole knows that one of the main ingredients in all of their candies is sodium, and lots of it.
Oh, wow. That's almost like, I almost felt like that was some kind of story from the Bible for a minute. I almost felt like that was an offshoot of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Like Lot's wife kept bringing home this salt that he's just like, it's not candy, throw it out. It was just sort of like setting them up for what would happen a few months later with the whole, where we lived. Just anyway. And we all, of course, went to school. Speaking of the duck that's on the every time I see the duck on the Jacinto package, I think of the kid. I think I brought him up before. Annoying little shit that I went to high school. At high school, he was gone from high school. I went to grade school with him, middle school for a while, I think. And he was one of the Richie Rich kids. But he was the kid. We all went to school with the one kid who could do the Donald Duck impression. And he thought it was the greatest thing ever. And of course, it was just annoying as hell. We all wanted to like lock him in the closet and leave him there for a couple of weeks until he got the message. So, yeah, I'm sure we'll get letters now about Jack is a bully. And
yeah.
I said we wanted to. It was just that it was the first human reaction. And then we backed off and, you
controlled yourself.
We all controlled ourselves. Yeah, we decided to have a sit down with him and just please do the impression more. But just say things that are very distasteful, like Daffy or Donald Duck. Daffy Duck would have been a better impression, I think, of the two famous ducks. But now they own both, of course, because what does Disney not own? They purchased everything that was sacred and good in my childhood. It's gone. It belongs to them now. So,
yeah, they do. They have quite the canon of material. And, speaking of canon of material, I think a few episodes ago we were talking about how I have a tendency to go down rabbit holes, if you didn't already know. And I bought my first book on UFOs not too long ago. I believe it was Imminent by Luis Elizondo. And so I bought that book, and then, 5 books later. So now I just finished actually Leslie Kean's book on UFOs. And I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about it during our coffee session here today, because I really do feel like I have amassed now a fairly good collection of U.S. UFO literature. You've got the Imminent by Lou Elizondo is one of those that is really kind of more of the modern perspective of a lot of the things that we've seen in the news as of the last 6 months, right? And we're talking specifically about the hearings that have happened on Capitol Hill. And then, this Leslie Kean book is actually one that was published not too long ago. It would have been probably one of the most noteworthy ones that was published right before Lou Elizondo's book, which, it was published back in 2011, just for a reference. And Lou Elizondo obviously was a government employee, and he worked for the Pentagon. And so he had a very firsthand knowledge of some of the programs that the government was involved in. Leslie Kean takes it from another perspective. She was more of a reporter who then kind of stumbled into the UFO, category because of some of the stories she was working on for National Public Radio and other media outlets that she worked for. And one of the things that this book is really good, I think, on is it kind of gives you a good perspective of what the international happenings when it comes to UFOs are from an other country's perspective. And the reason I wanted to talk about this today was I kind of feel like maybe there is a very missing point in some of our conversations when we're talking about, well, the government has this black box closet that they're hiding all these aliens in, and they're refusing to let us know what they are and the technology that they've maybe, gained from that. And, we want answers. And then, you have the drones that have popped up in the last few weeks, and nobody really knows what those are. And no one has really a good answer for what those are. And, I think there's a really good report that was actually published by the French government, and it was called the Cometa Report. And I forget what the acronym stands for, but essentially the French government went out and published not only a summary or some kind of a understanding of what maybe some of these phenomenon were, but really kind of went through and painstakingly said, okay, here are all of the reports that we know of, and here are and here are the ones we just don't have answers to. And not to say that, yes, they are ET's cousin and this is the planet he's from, but really just that, we don't have an understanding of what these are. And my point for bringing up the European perspective is that how vastly different other countries have treated this phenomenon than the United States has.
Yeah, and you could go one step further than that and talk about what the not only governments but also the inhabitants of other nations innately are, I guess, told or in some ways trained to believe about this phenomenon. If you've ever watched Ancient Aliens, Giorgio Tsoukalos is of Swiss descent, I believe. And that would be more of the European bent, which I think is vastly more open to, because the French have essentially disclosed everything. They've gone through disclosure, but apparently they don't seem to possess what you would think is the lockbox full of information that some of the other governments of the world do. But anyway, the thing that Giorgio always talks about is how this, fair that we're playing out as being so cutting edge or groundbreaking, the show itself, Ancient Aliens, the premises of people being here before, modern man and before all of this. And it's, it's a ludicrous notion to the West. The Occidental world is still in denial and looks at it as a fascinating piece of fiction. And it's just all for, whereas it's a common dinner conversation. It's just, it's common in other countries. The South American countries, think a lot of their traditions, from what I know, there is, the notion of the sky, the Space Brothers, I think is what they were called or used to refer to them as, and they were real. And the notion that Quetzalcoatl and some of the gods of the ancient peoples were actually beings from other dimensions. It doesn't have to be put to them in the same, subtext. It's already there. They already not only understand that, they embrace that as being the truth. And the Vedic traditions are the same. People in India, that's their history, especially from a theological perspective. The Vedic texts are filled with references to beings from elsewhere, and they're not as cryptic as the references to angels in the Bible or, the things that might be just placed here and there in Western theology. So, from a government perspective, there is a different worldview, certainly, but there's also a different belief structure surrounding this subject. And isn't it interesting that we being people of the West, would be a little bit late to the table in that realization? Because if there's one thing that I've learned that people in the West have a tendency to do, is they have no understanding of what a culture or a mindset or anything else that might exist somewhere else in the world is like before they go judging it and before they go saying, well, they know this, this, and this about it. I can't tell you. I mean, I've been on enough ramblings on the podcast before. It's no surprise Jack Hansen has been labeled as a communist in the past when people get pissed at him about one of his anti-capitalist bents. And so they just naturally hop to that. And my first question for any of them is, what do you really know about communism? Have you been to a communist nation and even visited? Have you lived under its form of government for a while? Look, I'm not pushing any variety of governments. I think they all stink. I think we need Smurfism. I've told you that. I'm behind the blue. I'm back in the blue all the way on that one. But I'm just, when you can't necessarily make a comparison without being in some regard somewhat familiar, somewhat learned on what you're throwing a comparison out to. So anyway, I don't want to get too far off the track, but I feel like that's what we have a tendency to do when we look at everything is we don't take a world purview, we take an American purview. This is the way, because we're so used to just leading the charge and being the torchbearer for this. I mean, Lady Liberty was given to us by the French, by the way. I don't think for that purpose, perhaps to remind us to light a fire under our asses once in a while so we don't do that, rather than actually being this torchbearer for, we're the ones that light the way for all the thinking in the world. So it is interesting. The French have been pushing for a larger peace to disclosure for a while. There are stories about the UN having wanted to do this for many years with their states, the states that belong to the UN, which of course are most of the states in the world. Now, I believe there are 193 that are recognized. There's only a few outliers, as they would say, or disputed territories that are not recognized. So, yeah, I think it's important for us to do that. But the only way we do that is we put down our burgers and French fries, as ironic as that may be, and we take a look at what someone else is saying, like picking up a book like you did.
Well, and I think that there's a big difference in, somebody who, I think you have to really, really look at the source of information, and you have to judge the source of information, not just whether or not I believe this or disbelieve this. If I think that's really something that a lot of the UFO literature and I guess just, the UFO canon gets really caught up in is there's, either a believer or a non-believer, and both people kind of stick to their polar sides of the room. And one of the things that this author really does well, I think, is she really just presents facts, and they're facts that have been, firsthand accounts by people often in the military and people who have really seen these unknown phenomenon and not really saying whether it's this, that, or the other thing, but really just saying, here are the facts. It was Tuesday at 3 p.m., and this is what I saw hovering over my backyard at, Tuesday at 3 p.m. And I think that sometimes we have a tendency, I think, to, either want to believe one thing or trying to, rush back to our judgments, like you said. But, this one is a different one, I feel, than Lou Elizondo, because Lou Elizondo obviously had a firsthand knowledge of the government programs that the United States government was involved in. Leslie was really taking more of an international view of what some of these other countries had experienced, and as a result, what their government did because of some of these things that have been reported by their citizenry. And it is a little bit scary how, even with the United States government, there has almost been a, what is the phrase? Is it plausible deniability, where you literally will deny anything just because you want to deny it?
Yeah, I think that's right. So you have to look at who stands to gain and who stands to lose in all of these equations too,
Absolutely.
because you're talking about the presentation of fact. Well, I wouldn't be one to argue with you because I'm going to take the word of just about anybody, quite honestly, that seems sincere. I mean, how do you gauge it? We know we have stagers, we know we have hoaxers that are out there still, but most of the people who have been directly impacted, especially military personnel, by interactions with craft or even beings purportedly from wherever, are wishing that they'd never had that experience at all because their life becomes a living hell.
Yeah.
But it's something that the experience itself, much like we were discussing NDEs a few episodes back, that experience is almost like a calling in a way. It doesn't allow you to shelf it. There's really no way. I can remember thinking about, I believe it was it may have been Pattison who was involved in the Rendlesham Forest incident. There were a couple fellas there that had direct contact with what was reportedly sort of like a scout craft, if you will, and one of them touched it and was relayed a binary looking series of ones and zeros that he remembered. And it was a lot of them too. And when the message was actually translated by some service years later, it broke down into coordinates that were on the globe. And they had to do with an island that was of mystical origins that would have been written about years ago by the British. But in this instance, it would almost seem to imply that the island was real at one time, or maybe it is real. And it's one of those disappearing base islands we hear about. There's all kinds of speculation. But my point is that when he's talked to about this, there's sort of two sides of him now. One is, I wish this had never happened to me. It was the worst thing that ever happened to me because it ruined my forward life, the life that essentially is constructed within the paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
There was not a single thing that it didn't interfere with. It interfered with my job. It interfered with my marriage. It interfered with my interpersonal relationships. It interfered with my ability to sleep soundly. But there was also this other side that suddenly got carved out, which was this calling, which was, look, you can't put this away. And no matter how many trips to the shrink you make, you won't be able to digest this in a way that we are told that we can do this psychologically, or that we learn that we can do this psychologically, or even medically. You can't get rid of this. This is baggage, essentially, that you're meant to have and that you will haul through the rest of this life, and you will figure out how to unpack it in a way that's appropriate for what it is, but you can unpack it in a conventional manner, not the way that we think about. And he doesn't maybe say that in as many words, directly, but he definitely infers it. You can tell that that's the issue. And you hear that from a lot. I think Whitley Strieber would be another example of someone who, through his work, has definitely shown us that that's true. I mean,
Bob Lazar for sure.
Yeah, these things are, to say they're highly impactful doesn't go far enough. These people's lives have been turned upside down by what it is that they've seen, heard, felt, experienced, etc. And they're not willing to put it away, probably more than anything because they can't, because there's something about it that doesn't allow them to. Once you come into contact with this knowledge, for lack of a better word, there's something about it that won't let you go. So I also feel like it's important for us to remember that as we deal with what the governments are talking about and what we're hearing about, because you could just as easily have somebody come in and refute everything you just said about, well, these aren't facts, Michael. These are, this is a guy who, let's face it, he saw it in his backyard. It was 15 years ago, or it was 20 years ago, and memories fade. Look, where's my picture? Where's my empirical evidence that I can go study? Well, there usually isn't any. And if there is, it's trace elements. And you immediately debunk the photograph, and you immediately say, well, that mark on the ground was really nothing. And even you sent the blades of grass off to have them scientifically analyzed, and they've got particles of what looks like nuclear fission going on in them or something. They just dismiss it and say, well, it's anomalous. I mean, they'll dismiss anything that they need to in order to clear the way for the narrative that they want. So, again, unfortunately, we just don't get any straight answers from any of the books that we read or any of the things that we get presented with. it is all dependent on speculation. But I feel like, again, I told you about the fella who I really like that does the research. His name always slips my mind, Richard Dolan, who I kind of used to harass in his little postings that he would do, his vlog, because he's just bashes heart-based thinking. He's so against the spiritual aspect to it. And where I'm really dichotomous in that way, I don't believe that there's another way to truly know the phenomenon without taking it from a heart-based perspective. I think it has to be funneled through that portion of you, which is not logical. It's not mental. It has to be placed there because that's what it is. I don't know if it's evolved to that point. I don't know how it got, I don't have the answer to those questions. I just feel like as humans in this experience, that's where we have to place it. That's the grist that we have to put it in within ourselves in order to make any sense out of it, if there is any sense to be made out of it at all. And I think the answer is, at the end of the day, there's no sense. It just is. And that's troubling for a lot of people, because the logical side of people, that rationale that our brains, these computers, these fleshy computers we have in our head, they want to give us that. And they kind of over direct us to say, no, there's an absolute. This is, there has to be an answer to this that's prosaic. But the problem is that's not what really makes us tick. The brain can die, but if the heart lives on, the electricity in it, so does the body. A person can be brain dead and still be alive, can they not? Well, so, I kind of rest my case in some ways with that. The center for that other side of us is in the heart. And one could argue that that's also where people's beliefs and theologies and other things that aren't of tangible origins that can easily be established reside. And we've forgotten how to go there. We're so interested in getting to this clear and present answer about what's in front of us in a way that we can understand it, that we've forgotten that there are a multiplicity of ways to understand things that defy the brain, that defy what the brain can look at and go, okay, I can touch it, I can see it, I can feel it, I know where it comes from, we can identify it, catalog it, stick it in a box, and we're done. It's going to be in a textbook next year. That's what science does. This is transcendent of that.
Yeah, and I think that is a common denominator in a lot of people who follow this subject matter, is that they are thinkers. They are people who like to think beyond just conventional ideas and ideals. And I think that there's this cool thing about being able to be told something and go, wow, that totally rocks my understanding of it. And I think that it's very important that we always look at these things as what they are, which is somebody put this in writing. It's a book. It's something that they're standing behind. Whether you choose to believe it or not, that's your own belief, right? It's a free country, and that's what makes America and this world so great, is all these different ideas. But the thing that really kind of got me kind of wanting to bring this up during our conversation was how quickly the drone phenomenon, if we want to call it that, and whatever it is, has quickly disappeared from the lens of the national media, and how quickly we just have moved on to something else. And it's almost like, they just kind of shelve that and nobody really wants to know further. And I think it really starts to boil down a little bit more into what we were talking about previously, which is, are they now normalizing some of these aerial phenomenon and potentially masking what could otherwise be a unknown entity that is visiting us from another planet?
They could. I think I hopped on the sort of the train, one of the cars in your theory about disclosure in general, which is that it really has far less to do with, trying to get to the bottom of ET. And really it's about this, again, dark faction, if you will, of the government, or these secret compartments that are just running amok. And they're not under any oversight, and their funding is like through the roof, and they're becoming sources of enormous power and control outside of any federal constraints, outside of any governmental constraints at all. And that bothers obviously a lot of people, I would guess, from the Oval Office down. President really, in my opinion, has become such a titular position, especially in the last 60 years or so, that I don't think it really has much power, quite frankly, but that's kind of another matter. So, yeah, it's possible that's what's going on. It's possible. I think a lot of times what we see with human beings, especially again in the West, and especially with trends and with behaviors that are of a group nature. Now, we have to remember that the media is entirely influenced by the powers that really run the show. Oz behind the curtain, that is the massive powers with all of the money. They control the media, whether we like it or not. And that's just, they bought their way into the media years ago. And we know that they can pick up the red phone at any time and say, hey, this whole story we've been running, kill it. It goes away today. They have the power to do that. And I think it's been well established that anyone that's been paying attention for even a small portion of their life here on Earth, no matter how long it may have been, isn't being silly or paranoid by suggesting that there is a they. They hate the notion that they can be identified even in such a passing manner, even in such a, sort of a vanilla manner. But we know they are there pulling strings and crossing wires and doing things that control everything. So it's possible that this was some kind of an experiment, that this was some kind of a game, I guess, if you will. We were all hamsters in the wheel watching these things in the sky, and they say, okay, fine, we're going to give him this, we're going to spoon feed this for a month or so, and then we're going to take it away, because it was a big experiment to see psychologically how we would react collectively as a nation, as a people. But it's also possible, Michael, that it just ran out of steam, because that is the length of our attention span in the 21st century. It's flavor of the week, and we know that. Look at mass shootings. I mean, I hate to use that as an example for some ways, but mass shootings were incredibly rare, few and far between. Charles Whitman was really the first to commit one in the 60s, and then I can't recall another one that occurred. Perhaps there were a few very isolated incidents, but the next one I can remember was in the 80s at the McDonald's restaurant, I think in Southern California somewhere. And then, fast forward another 20 years, and we've gone through Columbine, and we get Sandy Hook later on, and these other. And now when we hear about these things that occur, they are just sort of integrated into our world. They're just a normal part of everyday life. Oh, yeah, somebody went off half-cocked, killed 7-8 people in a mall somewhere, South Carolina, Missouri, pick your state, pick your city, pick your town. It happens. We're used to it. But I don't know if we're used to it because of anything they have done. I think it's just a fact of society, and we say, well, look, I don't want to hear about this anymore, so we'll push it to the third story or the fourth story, and eventually it doesn't even show up. I remember listening to ABC, and because we play the 5 o'clock, or we play the top of the hour news that's 5 minutes long at work, and I don't recall when this was, but there was something about, of course it was, classic like Taylor Swift or the Super Bowl or something. It led the newscast. I want to say I made an allusion to this or talked about it even when we were having a show some time ago, because it happened recently enough. But this absolute piece of rubbish, this fluff, this non in our world, but it's backed by all this money and all this popularity, actually was, to the estimation of a major news outlet, in this case it'd be ABC News, who does the news where I work, the top of the hour news, the national news, the world news. To someone's estimation inside that company, this was the biggest thing that people in their listening audience, millions wide, should know about right now, is Taylor Swift's concert tour or some football player. And that's not only alarming, it's offensive to me, quite honestly, because we know that isn't true. We know that that's not true. But when it comes down to you get what you're given and that's it, it's kind of like dinner, right? If they haul out mud, and chicken legs and, or beaks and that's all there is to eat, you're going to eat it probably eventually. You may protest for the first few days, but once hunger sets in, you're going to eat it. And they know that. And so that's what's given to us. And so we're also kind of handcuffed in a way because it's like, well, this is what I'm being given. Of course I'm going to eat it up. But the choice is still there to run away from it and say, fuck ABC, I'm not listening to your news anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's why it pays to be cynical sometimes. Now, I think that, like, for the most part, you and I think are not overly sky is falling Chicken Littles. And I think that for the most part, we can look at most day-to-day happenings and go, okay, now that's bullshit. Oh, okay, now that, okay, I can get on board with that, but now it's bullshit. And so I think that it pays to be cynical sometimes and just to be somebody who is open-minded to what you're being served.
Well, and again, I hate to pick your words apart, but I don't know that I would call it cynical because to me, it's critical. It's critical thinking. Being a cynic, I think, transcends that to the point where, maybe maybe that's what happens to you once you've lost you kind of any innate ability to feel like you can think for yourself. You can turn the dial off. It's like, well, this is just what they're throwing at me and I'm going to have to accept it. And you really don't. You can turn the radio off if you want to, God forbid, or the TV, merciless heaven forbid you turn the TV off. But we've all just gotten way too comfortable. And, there's a lot of, I would call them like idiosyncratic parts of people's personalities. Collectively, I would call them nuances of people's personalities, but they're really not. They're becoming dominating factors about people's personalities. This screen time addiction is a real problem for our world, for a world that is connected, for the world that's connected to the web. This is becoming a huge issue. And we see it, the first that we started seeing of it, remember when smartphones first came out and Star Trek was finally in the palm of our hand and we could actually watch something on a video or TV or we could listen to music. How amazing was
that moment?
And we had the car crashes started because people were distracted, of course, doing something that's, highly like tangible. This is my hands are on the wheel. I've got to steer. This is a large steel machine going 60 miles an hour on the road. And suddenly it smashes into something because I'm not paying attention. And then we had the funny videos that came out of guys falling down manholes or, looking at their phone when they're walking and they trip and go in the fountain and, haha, it's hilarious. But what it's led up to is far more catastrophic than that because it's become a real mental and again, moreover, a heart-based just checkout. It's one thing to be a mentalist and kind of not listen to or eschew your heart space and say, I don't listen to that stuff my heart tells me because it's rubbish, it's BS. I'm a man of, or I'm a person of, empirical evidence and I need to be shown things and there exist and then all that God stuff is for somebody else. Well, that's one thing, but it's another thing to have that already checked out and then your mental capacity flies away too because you've given it over to kind of an involuntary reflex of just, I need my screen time. I got to look at my phone for so long every day. I got to see and so, and again, the argument that comes up though is, well, Jack, it's not unhealthy until ... until a person stops going to school or until a person checks out from life altogether or they're not seen for months on end or they don't they quit pursuing relationships on the outside.
I think we're there now.
Well, yeah, I would say we are there now.
Yeah.
But I would also argue that it's still a problem because where is the lid? What's the balance? I mean, when I was growing up as a kid, it was pretty lenient, I will say that. But I think most people growing up had like television timeouts. Their mom or their dad would say, okay, you can only watch so much of this, then you're done. TV goes off at 8, 9, 10, whatever it might have been.
It's part of development. It's part of learning. Yeah.
So, I don't know. It's such a quagmire now that we're in, and we can't, as we've probed before here, we can't say that it's just this big problem, because it's not. Because being connected is a wonderful thing. Being connected is what makes this possible, and it's what allows us to share it with the world that's out there. It's just, what do we do with it? I guess, how much of it do we actually engage in, and how are we balancing that with the rest of our lives? But then there's also that 1,000,000-foot view, which somebody comes in and says, well, who the hell are you to say that, Jack? People can spend their lives however they want. And that's true. I believe people can live their lives however they want to. But when they're goaded unknowingly into wasting it, or into a position where at the end of their life, or maybe when they actually die, they'll leave and go, God, I wasted a lot of fucking time. You don't want to get there. Mm-hmm. And then that's when it becomes unfair.
Yeah, and is time wasted if you don't realize that you're wasting it? That's the question too. And it is kind of philosophical, but at the same time, I don't know who the person is other than ourselves to say, this has gone too far. And unfortunately, when you're that person in that situation, sometimes you don't realize it's gone that far until it's too late.
Yeah. Well, it's just, we're always at a crossroads. I'll go back to one of those lines that I just absolutely hate. One of those wretched lines. It's one of the most canned lines that anybody can write. I actually heard Dave Ramsey, our old buddy, my old buddy anyway, using that line to promote one of his shows the other day, when he says, in these troubling times. And I'm just thinking, when have times not been troubling, Davo? You've been a millionaire 3 times and lost it all, and now you're back on top of the world. When are times not troubling? Times are meant to be troubling, in particular on a mass scale, en masse. They are designed to be troubling. We should be troubled by some of the directions that we are going. I don't think this experience was designed to be Shangri-La. I think, the idea is for us to... I'm not entirely sure what the idea is for us to do at the end of it all, or in totality, but I don't think it's to sit back and lament when times weren't troubling, because when have we known times that weren't troubling? The best we can do is when we're sitting at home or we're on vacation and the rent's paid, we have a place there's plenty of food in our bellies. I was listening to this PSA this morning. I don't remember what her name is. It's a good thing, because I'd waste her for it. But let's just pick your celebrity. Let's just say, no offense, I loved her in what's that show with Tony Danza, Who's the Boss, years ago, but we'll just take Judith Light, okay? She was the mom in Who's the Boss with Tony Danza, okay? Sorry, Judith, I'm going to use you here. Love you, though. Because it was really kind of like that Lister celebrity. It was just like, really? So Judith Light comes on, and here's this heartwarming music in the background, and she starts giving examples of trouble, speaking of which. Troubled times for a mom who's trying to raise 2 kids and juggling 2 jobs and going to school part-time, or a pregnant woman who's in drug recovery, who hasn't been able to pay the rent for several months and is looking at being thrown out on the street, or, and then it was the next one. It was, a teenage girl who lost her parents and, couldn't find her way and hasn't eaten a meal in, 3 or 4 days. And then she says, hi, I'm Judith Light. And the first thing I did by myself sitting in the control room was I go, and I have none of these problems. So why the fuck are you listening to me?
Well, she did have to co-star with Tony Danza. And so, maybe that was her problem.
Sam Kinison, God rest his merry soul, had a great routine. I've noticed too, he has been, you talk about like some of the people from, days gone by that have been canceled. His stuff is hard to find. Some of his more well-known things were, but this was an HBO special that I remember. A lot of that stuff should be on YouTube. I had to cull the internet with the finest of fine-tooth combs to try to find this, and I did, but I just feel like he's one of those guys that was canceled, to no end by this culture today. In any event, he has a great routine because he was just so good about sticking it to who truly deserved it, which was all of us, for accepting this bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
Because he had one of the things where he was talking about sitting there watching late night TV, and a picture of an emaciated child comes on the screen, and suddenly a somber voice comes over the airwaves and asks him to reach into his pocket and feel bad about money that he's already spending. This was before your daily latte, which was one of those big, like, contrasting agents they started using later on in the world of charity and the world of big philanthropy, which is a giant business too, by the way, but we don't have to go down that warren today either. But it's just like, well, for the cost of the daily donut you're eating, or for the cost of the newspaper, that was the one that they used to use, and it was probably that. For the cost of your 35-cent newspaper that you get in the morning, you could feed this child for a week. And he says, well, I'm kind of thinking the film crew could give this kid a sandwich.
Of course.
And they're right there. And then he says, in his screaming way that he had his shtick, he was just like, no, don't feed him yet. It doesn't work unless he looks hungry. And so what that's sticking it to is the insanity of it all, because that's what people are forgetting, is that has to be filmed by somebody. That has to be produced by somebody. That has to be narrated by somebody. And all of those somebodies have a lot of nickels that are tied up in trying to get more nickels. Now, granted, they may not be able to save or feed an entire nation, but they definitely could have made some kind of an impact to the ones that they were filming who were starving to death right before their eyes. But of course, it's a ploy. It's a marketing gag. We got to be able to see the pain and suffering to get people to reach into their pockets. So which is the lesser of two evils? I mean, it's an insane world when you go down that hole, and nobody wants to. And I feel like that's why his stuff has gotten just remarkably brushed off and removed everywhere. It has nothing to do with the fact that people found him offensive for his racial content or his sexist content or any other content that has to do with the isms of the world. Had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the fact that he was so emboldened as to just say, Fata Napoli to the whole thing, to that whole mess. And I know there are a lot of people in philanthropy that are trying to do good, but it's a massive business too. And so I just, what am I trying to say? I don't know. It's just, you'd better be ready to walk the walk if you're going to talk the talk, if you get into that. You know what I mean? It's a crazy notion why anyone on the planet has to starve, and is the right thing for all of us to do to renounce all of our worldly possessions and help those who have not. Yes, it really probably is, but so few of us are ready to do that. And I think that we're reticent to do that, not because we're the greedy sons of bitches that we've made ourselves and each other out to be, but I think it's because we're scared. Yeah. Because we don't see an end to this. If someone knocked on my door right now and I knew they were an angel from, God, or, I knew that they were of angelic origins. I knew that they were, make them whatever you want, like a being from another world that can see into the future or that knows everything, some omniscient or omnipotent, thing. If I'm convinced, it knocks on my door and says, hey, Jack, if you just give up all this crap today, there's a truck out front, we're going to load it up. If you just give all that up, you would be the catalyst for enough people to do that the world would literally change in a couple of weeks. We'd have food for everybody, and like all this suffering could be avoided every day. Would I do it? Fuck yeah, I would do it. Of course I would do it. There's no question about it. So, and I think that would be a lot of people's answer. But I think without that provocation, we're scared because we don't see an end to this, because we've also been trained insidiously that it's every person for themselves, and that all of the resources, that you can possibly have, right down to your Gucci shoes in your closet, they need to stay with you because you need those things.
Well, and I think that brings up this idea too of why has this been something that has been withheld from the American people for sure. But I mean, the people of, the wider public, I would say, to the certain degree, why is it that governments have hid behind this cloak and not wanted to essentially admit to what we all know is true. I think, well, you and I know is true. And it really does kind of come back to that control issue, doesn't it?
It always will. It always comes back to money and power, and they're linked together because the money nowadays is the power. But the weird thing is that when you start reading enough, and I'm not really a big reader. I mean, you should know that. You read way more than I do. I just get exposed to some of this stuff by different means. Yes, I'll pick up a book every so often, but I guess I'm a much better writer than I am a reader because I have more patience to craft the words than I do to read them, which is kind of a shame. I wish I was the reader that you were and that my mother was, for example. But however I've come by whatever I feel like I know, or I've come by at least, what other people have said, you can kind of lay claim to that. But when you dive into enough of the people like the Noam Chomskys and even the George Carlins of the world, who, he's a great philosopher, even though he's a comedian, I feel like what you start to really get out of the whole thing is that this game that they play, the theys that we always talk about, these Oz's that are behind the curtain, they're the biggest slaves to the game of all of us. That, remember, money and everything, like right now, like my nude bomb, the old movie, The Nude Bomb. I always love to bring that in too. That. Yeah, if they dropped a nude bomb right now, and every single thing that was of non-biological origin or had been made from the earth, so every stick in your house, everything that was crafted, made out of plastic, certainly. I mean, yes, it's all from the earth in one manner or another, but unless it's still a piece of wood from a tree, it's not staying. It evaporates instantaneously along, so that's every vehicle, that's every house, probably, although there might be a couple people in a log house where the frame would be there, but nothing on the inside, everything, your computer, your appliances, your furniture, all this crap, it's all gone because a nude bomb has been dropped and you're literally just left there naked. We have ourselves and we have each other, and we have whatever that means to all of us at the end of the day, individually and collectively. That's all there really is. So to me, that helps to box in what I'm saying, in that we know, even though we've decided to champ at their bit and say, well, I'm addicted to all these possessions and this money, this train of illusory zeros, we know that's not real. There's a part of us that still knows none of that's real. It's not really what's happening here. It's a paradigm. It's a game. It's been put in place, and you have voluntarily accepted it and are playing it. And yeah, it's hard not to, because there's a lot of seemingly great rewards to get from that, isn't there, by playing this game? And it's also really hard to get out from under. Where do you go to not play a game where there's some kind of commerce that's conducted or some kind of trade? Or, you could probably come 3 rings down or 4 rungs down, but it's going to be hard for you to leave that behind anywhere with so many people on the planet fighting for the resources. Hence the problem. We're fighting for the resources. But anyway, the people that are in charge, the theys, they're the most locked into the game of all. They're the ones that are the biggest slaves to it because they're the ones that are the most reliant on benefiting from it. So that's very important to remember as we go forward and things progress and they change, because they will change. And the problem with change is that typically, just like a transformation for a butterfly, what goes on inside that carapace, inside, it's a grind. It's grueling. It's ugly. It's nothing you want to see. It hurts.
That's how the sausage is made.
Well, yeah, but then all of a sudden emerges this wonderful, fleeting as it may be, it's this wonderful creature, this beautiful butterfly with these outstretched wings. And I kind of see our progress as a species much the same. We've been in the, carapace for a while. We're in that cocoon, and we're coming through some really hard like malformation. We're coming through some really hard transformations right now. We're coming through some difficult times of morphing into something else that are requiring heavier rides and heavier, wiggles inside that as a people, as a collective, because we are starting to, our behaviors are beginning to echo that we're starting to get it. And sadly, some of those behaviors, yes, are the aforementioned mass shootings that happen and the people who freak, all of the mental illness, as we dub it, that's going on in the world. I'm not so sure it's mental illness as much as it's an absolute it's static that's happening. It's a complete there's a term I say, forgive, it's frizzle fucked. It's a complete, you're just fried because the real you gets that this is not sustainable. This isn't a way to be. And it pronounces itself with what we call mental illness. And I'm not so sure that a lot of those cases aren't just reactions to the fact that we are not in a good way. And it's all the body or the brain, or really more importantly, the heart perhaps knows what to do with that at some point. It just literally misfires. So, we talk about that too. My little diagnosis for maladjustment disorder that I have so much fun with, and that it's just like, I think that's a badge of honor for me. Of course, I would hope to be nothing more than maladjusted to this nightmare, because even though there are some good things that are in it, those good things would be a part of it without all of the nightmarish bullshit that seems to accompany it. So interesting times, but troubled. Yes, as always.
Right.
Of course they're troubled.
Well, and I think there's going to be a point where the evidence becomes so overwhelming that it'll be interesting to see how those who are playing the game and have the most benefit from continuing to play the game adapt their strategy.
I would offer this fantasy for people too. And I don't think it's a fantasy. I think it's a time that could come at some point in the future, but no one's ever really made this movie, have they? They've made movies that are somewhat similar, but there's always a nefarious intent, or there's always some kind of a hitch that doesn't work out so well for the people involved. I think of Childhood's End, which is it's a really cool story. It's a freaky story. That was, I want to say that was Ayn Rand who did that.
I remember what I was going to say.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
So this is kind of where I think we get into Stephen Greer's theory that then it becomes a militant shift in the strategy to where we all have to band together as humans to fight off, whatever undertone the newcomers bring to society. And who's to say that, it even rolls out the way that we're all talking about it hypothetically, where people show up and say, hey, we've got a new path. Who's with us? That kind of a Hollywood scene. But I think that's where then, the shift becomes this, well, we have to do it because of national security. And we have to, now take this new stance on these UAPs because, what do they want and why are they here kind of stance.
Yeah, well, you could file national security right in line with everything else that's not real.
Right. When has it never been not about national security?
Well, it's also not a real thing. I mean, yes, the notion of being secure on a national basis based on whatever nationality you are, your borders, your invisible borders are, is a point of influence. There's no question that has, in the play world that we live in, that definitely has broader implications, I guess, than not, but it's not a real thing. Again, if I drop the nude bomb, well, then national security just flew out the window. This tree is real. This tree is producing something that's absolutely vital for me to be here and giving me a reason to water it and to love it rather than to cut it down and to say it's a nuisance or it's blocking my view. national security is not a real thing. It's a bogus notion. Now, it may have some influence when we get worked up into it. Well, it's part of the game. Well, yes, but again, in the eyes of what's actually real and what isn't, and therefore what really matters and what doesn't, it's non-existent. And remember, you're talking about, like, what are they going to do when their position gets threatened enough? There's nothing that they can do, because when you're hawking a product that everybody suddenly doesn't want to buy anymore, and that is everything, by the way, that is hawked to us, from Doritos to gaming systems to, sex toys to, you name it, anything that you buy it's no longer relevant. And that's because, and I'm thinking of a really neat book it's Arthur C. Clarke is who wrote it. It's called Childhood's End. It's about these beings that come to Earth, and they bestow a great amount of technology, and they heal all diseases, and they're really good for humanity's progress. They're something else. But the one hitch is that we can never be seen. You can't see us. You can't know what we look like. And then finally, one day, they reveal themselves to the world, and they're these giant devil-looking things. They're red from head to toe, 12 feet tall, wings and horns, and they're Satan incarnate. And it's a really neat story. It's not so much about what we're talking about contextually. It's actually about the notion of prejudice in so many ways. It's actually it has to do with a lot of the underpinnings of what human, perception and behaviors are like, rather than these things we're talking about. But I think about a story. This one they haven't done because it wouldn't sell, because it's about not selling anything. And that is, what if you're offered something that doesn't require you to have a job for anybody else, first and foremost? So there's no, the notion of working for something is, the way we know it, is gone. There's no work to do really at all. There's no monetary system, and you don't want any of these toys that you have. You can give up. You're not interested any longer in your ATVs or your classic car collection or your pool table, or on and on and on. You don't want any of those things, because something has found its way to you to show you that all of those things which you feel the best about, that can make you feel the greatest, are right inside of you, and they're linked to what's all around you already. And you find your way using those things. It's the greatest euphoria you've ever known, and it's ongoing, constant, but it relies not at all on these tangibilities, on these items that
external sources.
Yeah, no external stimulation necessary at all. So therefore, no commerce as we know it, none of that. There's their death sentence right there. No one's going to want what they're hawking anymore. And that's the ultimate fear. And that's why the Sam Kinnisons, and I'm surprised George did as well as he did, actually making his way onto a TV with Bill Maher towards the end of his life and other things. But that's why some of the real poignant thinkers, the guys and the gals that'll come along and say, hey, here's what's really going on. They don't last too long in the public eye, because they are bad for business, man. The notion that what we're selling you isn't worthy alone is enough to get you canceled. But then to suggest on top of it that there's something that will come along, or something that already is there that can replace what we're selling you. Oh, now you're so wet. You're so dead. It's unbelievable. Like we're getting rid of you, man. And I think a lot of that was going on during the hippie movement of the 60s. And I hate to call it the hippie movement, because that's it's a term that people can take such shots at.
Yeah, or the counterculture. Hippies. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And so, if that were offered to you, and of course, free samples anytime you want, here, boom, snap a finger, and you're into that moment of euphoria, and you realize, I don't need any of this stuff. Well, there's the end of the road for the people that are pulling the strings today, because certainly the last thing we want to do is go to war and build weapons. For what? Why would we? Then we're really here. You know, we truly exist, and we've just realized that we're taking our first steps on this amazing ride without needing all of this stuff. We've thrown the bottle away. The nipple is gone. And I think that's what we're working on. It's hard. It's hard because no one said it should be easy. And the souls that have incarnated here to be light workers or to be a part of the light working schematic have it the hardest. The rainbow, as they call them, kids, the indigo kids, you know, that started showing up here. They can trace it as far back as the 50s, but I think they've always been showing up. I think they've been here with us in and out for a long time. And yes, inflated ego as it might seem, I do consider myself to be one of those because it's where I find the most of my identity wrapped up in, you know, the notion that I'm here from somewhere else to do what exactly, I'm not sure. I just know that I don't fit most of what I've been told. It doesn't make sense to me. In fact, I'm against that in so many ways. And there's a struggle that's occurring, and I'm on the side of trying to propagate the light and not ways to regress and go backwards into the shadows any longer.
So many colors, too many flying birds.
Well, you're welcome to borrow any of my books anytime, as long as you have a library card.
Oh, you know I do. They haven't taken that away yet. They'll get my library card when they pry it from my cold, gelatinized fingers.
Oh, Jack, until we meet again.
Sounds good, my friends.
In the rhythm of the universe. In the rhythm of the universe.
Well, it looks like Jack and Michael have finished up their latest chat about all things existence. But if anything they said got your own Existence Brewing, be sure and catch their other talks at existencebrewing.com and drop them an email to share your thoughts using contact@existencebrewing.com.
Existence Brewing.